The human lifted an arm, his long limbs easily reaching the lowermost branches. He grabbed at one of the strange pod like attachments from the massive tree. He brought it down, crouching so she could take a look at it. It had a cylindrical shape, with both ends coming to a tapered point. It was about the same size as the human's hand. Cadet watched as he brought his other hand up, gripped the strange pod with both hands before breaking it open down the middle along a seam she couldn't see. Inside were little pockets all filled with some type of seed like structures. Cadet eyed it curiously. It certainly looked like any other seed she had ever eaten in her life. It was only the fact that it was grown naturally on a death world that seemed to make her feathers twitch with unease. She looked up at the human suspiciously, feathers twitching. You are certain this is safe to eat? The human shrugged. No, but it's the safest thing I could think of. They're as bland and non toxic as it comes. There aren't exactly a lot of plants I know that have a high sugar content this time of year. Catette's crown feathers did a bit of a flick before she reached her talon up, gripping one of the cracked open halves of the pod from his hand. She looked at it a bit before giving it one last glance up to the human, as if to confirm. Try two or three of the seeds and see how you feel throughout the day. You're running out of your emergency nutrient blocks, so we're going to have to find you something else that you can eat eventually. Cadet sighed before tentatively poking at one of the seeds with her beak. Before she could second guess the decision, she ate three of the little seeds. She blinked. He was right. They didn't really taste like anything. If all goes well, we can start harvesting as many of these as we can. We'll have to find something else to round out your diet, of course, but at least it's something. He said as he stored the other half of the pod somewhere in his jacket and began walking again. Cadet nodded as she fell in step behind him. She watched as he did his usual head swiveling from side to side as they walked. It was as if he was constantly on alert, always checking for danger. His posture wasn't tense, though, just aware, vigilant. He seemed very comfortable with his surroundings, which she thought was odd. She wondered again how long he had been here, and she felt the desire to ask about it, but felt as though it would be a touchy subject, which made it all the more concerning. The human turned his head to the side as he walked, talking. We should probably reach my base by the end of the day, so hopefully we won't need to set up another camp for the night. Tet picked up her pace a bit to walk beside him. That is good news. We have been traveling for 9 of this planet's cycles already. Tet paused for a moment, thinking. Actually, I've been meaning to ask. Why were you so far away from your base to begin with? The human looked down at her, catching her eyes for a moment, before returning his attention to the surroundings. I have 2 separate bases I alternate between. One is for the warm season, and the other is for the cold season. It allows me to spread out my hunting areas and make sure that I have plenty of game to catch once it gets cold. I don't want to have to travel too far just because I hunted everything down during the summer, so it helps keep the populations more consistent. Cadet was both surprised and unsettled by the answer. That was a very thought out process for a hunter. She couldn't really fault him for his dietary requirements. Of course, it's not like he had a choice. So it was understandable that he would have to be careful with his food source, and it made a lot of sense. Still, she couldn't help a bit of unease at the thought of a hunter with a strategy. He looked down again before he continued, an eyebrow raised. I was actually at the halfway point between bases when I saw you. Cadet was stunned by that. He was only at the halfway point when they first met? Just how far away was his other base, she thought. Cadet shook her head. The human could certainly walk a long distance without getting tired. That much she had seen just by traveling with him. Maybe it was a common trait in humans to have such stamina. Conversation died down a bit after that as they continued their trek through the woods, Cadet staying very close to his side all the while. As they walked, the human would occasionally point to certain points and explain which ones to avoid and which ones were fine. Cadet hesitantly noted that the ones deemed fine may very well not be fine to her. She made sure to keep her distance from all of them. There was quite a nasty-looking plant that they encountered that seemed to take up a large portion of their trail in the surrounding area. It was like a wall of prickly hedges. He called it a cactus bush, one of the few words that actually translated well, apparently. And she had to agree with the apt name. After they went around the massive cactus bush, the human suddenly stopped in his tracks. Cadet accidentally bumped into the back of his legs at the abrupt pause. She was about to ask why they had stopped when he carefully lowered himself into a crouch, bringing up a finger to his lips silently as he looked at her. She didn't really know the meaning of the gesture, but his silent demeanor was all she really needed to see to understand. Her feathers flattened on her head, a bit fearful of what could make the human stop in his tracks. He leaned back a bit before reaching an arm out and pulling aside a section of the undergrowth. He pointed through the parted section, and what Cadet saw made her freeze. In the distance, among the low-hanging branches of some foliage, was a massive creature. It had a wide four-legged stance with a large horn on its bulky head, and all over its back was a thick layer of brownish scales. It currently had its head down, its mouth chewing absently on some of the fern-like flora. I call it a Komodo rhino, he said in a low tone. It almost sounded conversational, and Katet immediately noticed the lack of sibilance actually made him a little quieter than a typical whisper. What should we do? She asked, trying to replicate his low tone. She couldn't really do it and ended up whispering as quietly as she could instead. We'll have to take a bit of a detour. I don't want to have to deal with this guy right now. He'll mess you up pretty quick if you're careless, and I don't have the right weapons on hand to take him out. Before she could second-guess her outburst, she hissed, whipping her gaze up to the crazy human. You would pick a fight with this creature? She suddenly felt the human's hand close around her beak in one swift grab, his attention still laser-focused on the scaled creature through the underbrush. Katet instantly froze when her eyes followed the human's line of sight. The creature had lifted its head up, snorting in agitation as it looked around, its mouth paused with a mouthful of plant matter. Thankfully, it didn't look in their direction, since they were far enough back, but Katet almost dropped into a shaky pile of feathers anyway. And then the human turned his head around. Don't do that again, the human said sternly, his eyes sharp. Katet nodded quickly in his grip as much as she could, eyes wide. That was probably the scariest look she'd ever seen from him. Even more terrifying than the 1,000-pound death world fauna that she almost just alerted them to. The human's eyes seemed to squint strangely before he released her beak slowly. Just keep your voice down. This thing is very territorial. The moment it sees us, it'll start charging. Katet nodded silently again, listening to every word. The human looked over to the creature again. He's a bit too close to home for my liking, so I'll take care of him later. But right now, I'm more concerned with us getting back to base. Katet swallowed nervously, afraid to even speak again. She followed behind him as he slowly stood up in a hunch and turned back the way they came. After getting far enough away, he took a wide berth around the creature's location. Katet made sure to keep her mouth shut after moving again. She felt foolish for being so careless, so stupid. She looked up at the human's back and noticed that he seemed a bit tense. Never before had she felt like such a young, naive hatchling again. Katet started mid-step when the human looked down at her, sighing. I'm not mad, Cat, just concerned, so you can relax a bit. Katet tried to relax, but found that she couldn't. She fidgeted under his gaze, wings shifting on her back unconsciously. The human closed his eyes for a second before opening them. He stopped walking. Normally I'd say it's okay to make a few mistakes, but the harsh reality is that you can't hear, Cat. The second you make a bad decision could either mean death or injury, he said, his eyebrows pulled up in such a way she had trouble understanding his expression. Either way, he was definitely very, very serious. Katet's feathers fell, and she lowered her head even more. The human crossed his arms as he looked down at her. And I thought that was perfectly clear, especially with you going on about how this planet was a death world and all, he said as he gestured with a hand generally to the air. Tet met the human's eyes. He seemed more concerned than angry, and she somehow felt even more like a hatchling getting a firm chiding from their mother. Katet lifted her head back up, straightening. I'm sorry, you're right. That was very reckless of me. It won't happen again. You've gone far enough out of your way to help me. The least I could do is make sure I don't do anything stupid, at least that I'm aware of. She said as sincerely as she could. A moment of silence passed before the human nodded, uncrossing his arms. She seemed to do a bit of a small sigh before he crouched down, his expression softening a little. Like I said when we first met, I want to help you. I do. But you need to be more careful. There's only so much I can do in a situation like that. Believe it or not, there are some things that even I don't fuck with around here. A territorial Komodo rhino is definitely one of them. At least when I don't have the proper weapons. You have to pick your battles carefully. Katet nodded once and dipped her head down in apologetic fashion, head feathers fanning out in an array of purple. The human watched for a moment as she did so before he stood back up, pushing against his knees. Good, I'm glad you understand. Besides, the situation turned out okay, and it was a good lesson to learn. You definitely got much easier than I, he said with a bit of a sardonic chuckle. Katet relaxed from her bow, feathers settling. She really wanted to know what he meant by that, but decided against asking. She felt it better to keep her thoughts to herself for a while. Once they started walking again, Katet couldn't help but think back for a moment, back to their first meeting when he had made her an offer. The human walked forward slowly, stowing his bloodied scrap blade somewhere behind his back, his eyes focused on her in a permanent stare. It was as if he didn't believe she was there. At his approaching form, Catet seemed to snap out of a frozen state of terror and began to take a couple panicked steps backwards. The human's eyes widened at her reaction and immediately halted his approach. He threw his hands up in a yielding gesture, dipping his head down slightly. He bent his towering upright form into a slow crouch, his hands still in the air. Not once did his eyes leave her form, however. A couple of beats of tense silence passed before the human spoke. Are you all right? Catet felt like she took a plasma rifle to the chest. Her whole body flinched at the human's question. A question directed at her. She was still in a state of shock and couldn't seem to even process what he had said. She watched as he seemed to hesitate. A bit of confusion appeared on his face as he spoke slowly. Do you speak common? Catet blinked rapidly a couple of times. Heart still beating fast. The human was talking to her. This impossible situation was really happening. She somehow managed a small nod. He seemed to think for a moment before slowly lowering his arms. I saw you eject out of your burning ship. Do you have any severe injuries? Swallowing, she nervously shook her head, still unable to speak. That's good. Were you the only one on board? She nodded again. There was another beat of silence. The human's eyes looked down for a split second before sharpening suddenly. There was an emotion she couldn't quite place on his alien face. It looked like it was a strange mix of longing and doubt. Regardless, their intensity was frightening. Do you know where you are? What solar system? He asked in the same level tone he used earlier, his voice not exposing his true emotion. Not like his eyes, anyway. Catet was afraid to answer. What would happen to her if he did not like the answer? She had no weapons, no defense, no wings to fly away on. Steeling her nerves, she figured that if he decided to kill her, there was no use in delaying the inevitable. She took a shaky breath, meeting the eyes of the Death Worlder. I do not know. I was on a routine trip to the nearest port when I was ripped from hyperspace. The last thing I remember is waking up to my ship burning on atmosphere. Catet watched as his eyes dropped down to the ground. She nervously shifted as his hands seemed to tighten, the muscles in his arms tensing before going slack. She waited for another question, but he said nothing as he continued to stare into the dirt. Catet fanned out her crown feathers slightly as she rooted her stance more firmly. It was her turn to start asking some questions. Keeping a careful eye on his movements, Catet asked, Do you know which direction my ship went? I must inspect the damage. Perhaps there is something I can salvage, maybe even repair. The human slowly lifted his head up at her question, eyes hard. That was a little unnerving. She took another step back automatically. He stared at her for a long moment, which became increasingly uncomfortable as he said nothing. Her heart started to beat faster. Had she said something the human didn't like? The human's eyes squinted slightly, ending the uneasy staring contest before he spoke. Ship headed due west. You can't see it from here, but there's a small mountain range over that way. He gestured with a peculiar jab of his hand over his shoulder, one of the digits pointing out behind him. My advice would be to leave it and forget about it. Catet felt a bit of anger at the suggestion, but her fear of him stifled any of it showing in her tone. My ship is the only thing I have. I realize it's probably mostly finished, but I could at least get some supplies from it. It would take weeks to get to your ship from here, and I've been over that passage once before. It's a grueling one. Besides, you don't have to take my word for it, but for what it's worth, there's nothing left that'll be useful. Trust me. It'd be a waste of time and effort, he said with half-lidded eyes. Catet looked down at that, her head heavy. Weeks. He said it would take weeks. Catet wondered how she could possibly survive that long, how she could even make such a journey to her busted ship. It really was a hopeless endeavor, and she felt the weight of her predicament finally settle within her gut. It was a dense feeling, and it made her feathers shiver. She was stranded on a death world, and she didn't even have her crashed ship to salvage from. Just her ejection pod that had little to nothing in it besides some emergency rations. Her eyes began to rove around in a small panic. I can help you, the human said suddenly. Catet whipped her head back up to the human. Her eyes were wide as she leaned forward a bit. Help? He would help her? But why? This planet is dangerous, which I'm sure you've noticed, he said, turning his head slightly, as if gesturing to the dead native fauna behind him. And you look unarmed. It's not safe to be wandering around without any form of protection or shelter. He seemed to eye her for a moment before continuing. I have a base camp a few days from here. It's a place to start, to get your bearings, to decide your next plan of action. I won't force you to come with me, of course, but I promise I mean you no harm. I only want to help. Cadet looked hard into his eyes to see if there was any deceit behind his words, but all she found was a sense of earnestness. She realized suddenly that she had two options: survive alone on a death world, or follow this human in the hopes that he wouldn't do something awful to her. It took just one look at the dead creature behind him for her to decide that only one option provided any decent chances of survival. Okay, I'll follow your lead, she said simply. He nodded, his eyes strangely relieved for some reason, as he stood back up, taking a few small steps closer. What's your name? She looked up at him hesitantly as he approached, saying quietly, Cadet. Nice to meet you, Cadet. My name's Andrew Bailey, but you can just call me Andrew.